Happy Monday, everybody. Hope you're all doing well. We're on to week 8 of Foundations, and every Monday I do my best of 1, best of 3 meta review for Standard, and we'll be talking about the best of 1 decks according to Untapped, which is a third-party tracker, and then I'll be talking about best of 3 as well, using the Standard Challenge on Magic the Gathering Online. And I also will be talking about the matchups and also what changes have happened since last week and what cards you should look for in your opening hand. So it's a fair amount to cover. I'll try to get through all of it in about 45 minutes. And so sit back and relax and enjoy nerding out about Magic the Gathering. So first, number 1, according to Untapped in Tier 1, is still Mono Red Aggro. There have been no changes to the list since last week. And so we won't be covering this deck in depth. If there's no changes, I'll kind of just go over it quickly so that we can get to something else that has seen changes. The deck is favored against Dimir Midrange, Mono Black Discard, Golgari Midrange, Azorius Control, Azorius Oculus, and Domain. It's a coin flip against Rakdos Aggro, although slightly unfavored coin flip. And then it's weak against Mono Black Midrange, Boros Auras. Excuse me. And the opening hand, you're looking for Heartfire Hero and Hired Claw. You really want to start on turn 1 in this archetype. And, you know, throughout the weeks, there will be a little bit of repetition because I've got to do a balancing act of, like, people who have heard me throughout the weeks and also the people who have never heard me before at all, right? It's got to appeal to both crowds. So forgive me if there's a little bit of repetition, especially in best of 1. It tends to be a little repetitive. So in number 2, according to Untapped in Tier 1, is Boros Auras, and we do see a couple of changes this week, some that we have seen in weeks before as well. So this one is dropping the 3 copies of the Monastery Swiftspear and 1 Demonic Ruckus to bring in an additional Feather of Flight and the 2 Atali's Favor. So we usually see the balance between this. The Monastery Swiftspears come in when you need more 1-drops, when there's more single-point interaction that are shooting your targets that need the auras. And then the Atali's Favor comes in when the deck needs to extend a little bit further into the long range or into the mid-range part of the deck. And so that's what we see is going back to the Atali's Favor version. And the lands are also in a pretty budget space right now, so we're dropping the 3 copies of the Battlefield Forge, as well as 3 copies of the Inspiring Vantage, and the 2 copies of the Thran Portal to just bring in 4 mountains and 5 plains. And this works well enough, so if you are on a budget, you know, I think you should craft the lands, because I think they help, but technically I guess you can get away with it. Oh, almost forgot. So the matchups for Boros Auras is it's favored against Mono Red Aggro and Domain and Rakdos Aggro, Golgari Midrange, and Azorius Oculus. It's a coin flip against Dimir Midrange, and then it's weak to Mono Black Midrange, Azorius Control, and Mono Black Discard. Anything that really has the single point interaction to create the 2-for-1s or temporary lockdown. This strategy is a little weak to that as well. So the opening hand, I highly recommend looking for a Heartfire Hero or a Sheltered by Ghosts. All right, and Mardu Aggro sneaked into Tier 1. It's been on the border of Tier 1 and Tier 2, which just means how the standard deviations between the average decks lines up. So like Mono Red Aggro and Boros Auras are statistically comparable. They're within the same standard deviation according to their win rate. Mardu Aggro kind of dips down just slightly on the cusp. This week it's up at Tier 1. Last week it was at Tier 2. And it kind of fluctuates throughout the week, back and forth. So this one's number 3, according to Untapped, and it has no changes since we covered it last. It's favored against Mono Red Aggro, and it's favored against Boros Auras. So really what you're doing is the Boros Auras matchup is already favored against Mono Red. The Callous Sellsword then allows you to get a slight edge on your opponents who are not playing the Callous Sellsword version. But there, you know, it does make it weaker to certain strategies. It's coin flip against Dimir Midrange, similar to Boros Auras, and it is weak to Mono Black Midrange, still struggling against the single point interaction. And it has the same exact opening hand, which is the Heartfire Hero and the Sheltered by Ghosts. And really, the edge on Boros Auras is like 3 games out of 100. You know, it changes it from 50% to 53%. All right, now the top of Tier 2 is Selesnya Rabbits, and we see the Sheltered by Ghosts version is here to stay. which we saw last week. The only thing that's happening in this deck this week is a little tweak to the lands. So we're dropping the 4 copies of the Hushwood Verge to bring in 2 plains and 2 Lush Porticos, which are just the tap lands with the Surveil. So other than that, the strategy is still remaining the same. Selesnya Rabbits punishes Mono Black Midrange and Dimir Midrange by going wide through cards like the Knight Errant of Eos and Hop to It, the Offspring off of Pot Patch Recruit. Anything that has multiple rectangles in one card punishes the single point interaction. It's a coin flip against Mono Red Aggro. The Sheltered by Ghosts really helping that. It's an unfavorable coin flip, but it's still close enough to a coin flip. The Sheltered by Ghosts improving that matchup. It used to be weak to Mono Red Aggro, and so I think the Sheltered by Ghosts helps that. And then it's weak still to Boros Auras, like incredibly weak, like 30 some odd percent, maybe 40% versus Boros Auras. So it's definitely like it doesn't. The nice thing about the meta is it all has pros and cons, right? They all have answers. So the opening hand for this one is Valley Might Caller, Pot Patch Recruit, and the Hinterland Sanctifier. And again, you want to be starting on turn 1 in this archetype. And now for the newer archetypes, right? For the people who have been watching throughout the weeks, we haven't talked about Rakdos Lizards since Duskmorn, I think. It's been quite a bit. So fun to see it kind of pop up here into the top 8 this week. And we see a couple of changes. So we've got Alacia from Foundations that fits into the Rakdos strategy because it is Rakdos colors. But also the Raid works really well with the, like, if you have attacked, if an opponent has lost life this turn, kind of pairs with Raid, and you're able to return target creature with mana value less than or equal to Alacia's power from your graveyard to the battlefield. So you can bring back things like the Flame Cash Gecko, which then gets the boost for the mana if your opponent has lost life, and like there's some interesting synergies with Alacia. And so all in all, I think this list is going a little bit further towards the mid-range than it is just strictly aggro, because we've seen lists that aren't running Laughing Jasper Flint, for example, and then like the Valley Flamecaller, and really stacking into the lower edge of the curve. And so this one almost feels like something you would see more often in best of 3 than you would in best of 1. But anyway, we also have the Viashino Pyromancer. And this one works pretty well in the archetype because when it enters, it deals the 2 damage, which is something that this deck is trying to do, is damage your opponent so that you get the triggers of like Gev and the Fireglass Mentor and the Flame Cash Gecko. Other than that, though, it's just good old Rakdos Lizards. So we have no Scale of Shale, which was kind of more popular back when this archetype first originally came out. That gives you the lifelink, can kind of help out against mono red. But you've got the cut downs and the go for the throats. That gives you that nice interaction against the aggro strategies. And the opening hand for this one, you're looking for the Vine Lasher, the Hired Claw, so your 1-drops, and then your scaled Gev scaled Scorch is kind of like your Heartfire hero. It's nice if you have the 1-drops that are immediately going to kind of if you already have the enablers, then this deals 1 damage and gives you that +1/+1 and makes it so that you can kind of just curve out nicely with this deck. And this one does my soul good because I was a avid mono red Goblins fan back in the 90s, right? So number 6 in tier 2 is mono red Goblins, and if we compare this to the one that I covered 2 weeks ago, we can kind of see it's coming closer to the list that I was running when I did my own Goblins build. And so we've got the 2 Lords. So we've got the Dropkick Bomber and the Horde Master, and I like having both Lords as well as the 4 copies of the Cacophony Scamp. So I think my version wasn't running the Breaches and wasn't running the Painter's Studio, which I like. It makes it a little bit more mid-rangey. But we're dropping the 4 copies of the Frenzied Goblin, which is the 1/1 that can tap for red and make something not block. That's a Goblin. We're dropping Krenko and the Mob Boss, which was in there kind of to give you the Agatha's Soul Cauldron tap all of your Goblins. It was a little gimmicky. And so we're bringing in the 3 copies of the Breaches, which works with pirates, and not all of your Goblins are pirates, but some of them are, right? Some of them aren't, but you have a little bit of pirate synergy. But even just by itself, making something can't block kind of gives you what the Frenzied Goblin is trying to achieve, while just being a bigger goblin and also being able to create a treasure token or help you dig, just more versatility, right? And so I like the breaches over the frenzied goblin especially. And then, like I mentioned, we're bringing in the second lord with the dropkick bomber. Again, the until end of turn another goblin gains flying can be a way to win the game. And we're dropping out the lightning strikes, which I like. I don't think I was running them in my own. We're bringing in the torch the tower, which helps out against strategies like Rakdos Aggro or mono red aggro, which might be a turn faster than this deck, but we can kind of slow them down with a little bit of the torch the tower. And then we're also bringing in 2 copies of the Witchstalker Frenzy. Now, we don't have the Screaming Nemesis to be able to shoot them 5 damage to their face, but it's nice to have this sort of thing if you're coming up against something like Shieldred, right? Any of the 5 toughness problematic threats. And so we're dropping the Agatha's Soul Cauldron, we're dropping the Urbrask's Forge. Or Urbrask's Forge can be good, it depends on how good your opponent is at destroying artifacts, right? And so we're bringing in the Painter's Studio. And I like this one, because whenever you attack, attacking creatures get +1/+0 until end of turn. It kind of gives you a case of the Gateway Express without the removal. It's like the solved side of it. And then you can also use it for additional dig. For the 3, you may exile the top 2 cards of your library, and then you can play them until the end of your next turn. So you don't even have to play them that turn. Can give you some good options if it gets into the later part of the game. And we're also not just running straight 20 mountains. This one's going to 22 lands. We're bringing in the 4 Cavern of Souls to help out against counterspells. And then also bringing in 2 copies of the Soulstone Sanctuary, because it's a shapeshifter, it counts as a goblin. So you get a 3/3 that also gets affected by both of your lords. And so I like where the direction of mono red goblins is going. You can always go look at my gameplay video to kind of compare the 2 and make your own list and that sort of thing, right? This archetype is a little bit more new. It's a little bit harder to say exactly what you're looking for in your opening hand. Some of your best cards that you are looking for in your opening hand, though, are Squee, Dubious Monarch, Cacophony Scamp is particularly nice. The Horde Master and the Painter's Studio, being able to do this on turn 2 followed up by a Squee, is a pretty nice line. Also the Seer Slicer Goblin, if you do have one of your 1-drops, and then the Reckless Lackey. So you're kind of looking for, like, think about how your hand is going to curve out. If you're starting on turn 1, it's nice to get like a turn 2 payoff. If you have the Gallery, it's nice to have a go wide payoff like Squee, right? All right, number 7 is Mono White Lifegain, and also in tier 2, and having no changes from the previous week. So this archetype is favored against mono red aggro, gaining too much life for that strategy to race, and it's also favored against Dimir Midrange, largely for the same reason. It's weak to mono black midrange, so it doesn't do particularly well if your opponent is able to just destroy your Pridemate or your Essence Channeler. And the opening hand for this one, you're definitely looking for the Leyline of Hope, as you are with most ley lines, right? Essence Channeler is a particularly nice one to have in your opening hand, especially if you can follow it before with Rune Lurker Bat or the Healer's Hawk. Both of these, and the Hinterland Sanctifier. All of these 1-drop enablers are particularly nice in your opening hand. And then same with the Leonin Vanguard, right? Basically, this start with your 1-drops. Maybe that's what I should just say generally for best of 1. Start with your 1-drops. All right, and then in the 8th one here is Rakdos Aggro, and also in tier 2. And we do see a substantial amount of changes happening to the Rakdos Aggro, kind of going back to a version we've seen long ago, but with the Torch the Tower. So we're dropping the 4 Emberheart Challengers and the 4 Monastery Swift Spears. So really like decreasing the amount of bodies, but we're bringing in the 4 copies of the Manifold Mouse. And as you'll notice, last week I was talking about how the best opening cards are the Heartfire Hero and the Manifold Mouse. And some versions don't run the Manifold Mouse, but when you have the Heartfire Hero, I think it's a good card to run. So I can get behind that change, right? We're also running 2 less Blazing Crescendos and 2 less of the Dreadmaw's Ire. So the Dreadmaw's Ire has been completely removed. And we're bringing in the 4 Burst Lightning, which usually we don't see Rakdos Aggro actually involving disrupted elements or non-linear elements in their strategy. And because it makes it less of a true aggro deck, right? The Rakdos Aggro without the Burst Lightning and without the Torch to the Tower is more of a pure aggro deck and is favored against mono red. the more interaction that you bring in, the closer it's going to become a coin flip to mono red aggro, which is what we're starting to see, right? So there's like a give and take, but it's going to make you better at the decks that require interaction, like Dimir Midrange. And so pros and cons again to everything. So the 4 Might of the Meek helps the deck dig a little bit, but it doesn't help get the turn 3 win with the Slick Shot Show Off. 1 Torch the Tower helps again with the interaction and the problematic threats or blockers. And then we have the 4 copies of the Turn Inside Out. And this one definitely does help with the Slick Shot Show Off and actually makes up for it, right? Because Felonious Rage and Dreadmaw's Ire does 2 damage, whereas the Turn Inside Out does 3. And the first Monstrous Rage does 3. So you can do Might of the Meek plus Turn Inside Out plus a Fling plus the Slick Shot Show Off to deal 20 damage on turn 3, which this deck is largely trying to do. The Bane Splitters got cut. They kind of work well with the Heartfire Hero and the Cacophony Scamp. We usually see them kind of come and go throughout the weeks, though. And this one is favoring bringing in the black lands. You don't have to, but this time it is. There are some benefits to bringing in. There are certain matchups that it's beneficial to bring in the black, where you are going to blow this up and destroy a creature and then play Callous Sellsword as a large threat instead of shooting face. So it allows you to have a different kind of strategy that you can play with the deck rather than just going for the turn 3 Cacophony Scamp or Slick Shot Show Off. And so this one's dropping 9 Mountains to bring in the 4 Blackleaf Cliffs and the 4 Sulphurous Springs, and the 2 Rock-Face Villages, which work with your Heartfire Hero and your Manifold Mouse. So this strategy is favored against Dimir Midrange. It's a coin flip against mono red aggro. I think in its purest form, it's actually favored against mono red aggro. And then, once again, going less into the interaction. And then it's weak against mono black midrange and Boros Auras. Struggling against the single point interaction. If they're able to destroy your Slick Shot Show Off or your Cacophony Scamp, it kind of falls on its face. And then if they're able to gain life, you can kind of get out of range of this deck. And the opening hand for this deck, though, you're looking for Manifold Mouse and Heartfire Hero. All right, now on to best of 3. So for best of 3, I'll be talking about the number 1 and number 2 spots on the Standard Challenge, Friday and Saturday and Sunday's tournament. And it's a particularly nice tournament. We see a lot of really good Magic the Gathering players in the Standard Challenge on Magic the Gathering Online. And what I find is that the best of 3 meta tends to reflect what is happening on the Standard Challenge, but we're just like slightly lagging behind. So we might as well just talk about the Standard Challenge. And Gruul Prowess by Joao Claudiomes. It took down number 1 in the Standard Challenge on Friday, January 3rd. And so Gruul Prowess is... this week, what we see is that they're dropping the Questing Druid and bringing in the 2 Pot Patch Recruits. I did talk a little bit about my Gruul Prowess sideboard strategy that I posted in the community tab, and was talking about, some decks are bringing in Pot Patch Recruit as a sideboard option, and it's particularly nice to punish mono black removal, right? So keep that on your radar. It's definitely one that's being explored more thoroughly now, right? Or it's kind of it's trending, if you will, right? And we're dropping the Scorching Shot, which is the deal 5 damage for 2 red. Good against Shieldred and such. We're bringing in the 4th copy of the Burst Lightning. It's good against other aggro strategies where you have something that you want to pop with the 2 damage. And then we're bringing in we're bringing in 3 copies of the Scorching Dragonfire. And what's nice about the Scorching Dragonfire is that it exiles, right? So if you're coming up against Mosswood Dread Knights, Unstoppable Slashers, even Enduring Curiosities that you're shooting post-combat, there's a lot of sticky threats that are good to get exiled instead of having them stick around. And we're bringing out the 4 copies of the Innkeeper's Talent. That one has to do with so it is matchup dependent generally how good your opponent is at destroying enchantments. So the more people are anticipating you to be running the Innkeeper's Talent, the worse it's going to perform, because they're going to sideboard in a bunch of enchantment hate, right? Whereas if you're not running the Innkeeper's Talent, then they're sideboarding into kind of a whiff. And Barbed Batterfist, we've seen kind of in mono red as a way to kind of cheaply trigger the Valiant on Heartfire Hero and Emberheart Challenger. So it kind of gives you that equipment that you can then move around cheaply to repeatedly trigger your Valiant. And to make room for this land-wise too, we're tweaking it a little bit. So we're dropping the 1 mountain as well as the 2 copies of the Soulstone Sanctuary, and bringing in the Restless Ridgeline and the Rockface Village. So the Manland and the Valiant triggering land of Rockface Village. So the Soulstone Sanctuaries we saw last week, and if you look at my sideboard guide, there are certain strategies that are not as good against the Manlands, right? Predominantly also mono black removal. So, and then for the best of 3 sideboard, we can see that they dropped the 2 copies of the Ghost Vacuum, which is good against Azorius Oculus, good against any of the Enduring Vitalities and like Dimir Otters. It's also good against Enduring Curiosity and Dimir Midrange. It's kind of your typical graveyard hate. We're dropping the 2 copies of Pick Your Poison, which is very similar to Paw Patch formation, but it can hit artifacts. So it really gives the deck the artifact hate. And we're dropping 1 Scorching Shot and bringing out the 1 Soulstone Sanctuary. And the new flavor this week is Fiery Annihilation. So this one is kind of the alternative to the Scorching Shot, if you will, dealing 5 damage to a creature. But then you also exile an equipment, and if that creature would die, you exile it instead. So you're paying 1 more for the exile effect, and you can pop an equipment, which is somewhat relevant in this meta right now because we have Mabel in Boros Mice. And we also have Pyroclasm, which dealing 2 damage to each creature is also relevant against Boros Mice. So we're seeing a little bit more hate specifically towards that archetype. Pyroclasm also works pretty well in the mirror match, any of the decks that kind of are playing a lot of 1 and 2 drops. And we have an additional copy of the Questing Druid in the sideboard. There are matchups where you're going to want to bring in the Questing Druids all the way up to 4, and generally it has to do with being less of an aggro matchup, where you have more time to take advantage of Seek the Beast and dig into your resources. All right, number 2 on the Standard Challenge on Friday, January 3rd, was Esper Bounce by Iron Beagle, and this archetype has exploded in popularity. I heard that there was a video with CGB and Voxy playing this deck, but I haven't actually seen it myself. I just heard the word. And but anyway, this deck has been performing well, snagging a top 8 in last week's. Snagging a top 1 or 2 in my top 8 last week, and doing it again this week, right? So back to back, kind of. I think second place is it's a silver trophy, right? It's a medal as opposed to a trophy. Anyway, deck's very interesting. And this week we're seeing that they dropped 2 copies of the Spiteful Hexmage and brought in 3 copies of the Mockingbird. And when we talked about this in week 6, 2 weeks ago for my Meta Breakers, we were talking about, I think it had Mockingbird, but not Kaido. And not Bottomless Pool, which was mentioned by one of you as a comment that they could fit well into this archetype. So we're still seeing the fine tuning of this archetype happening, and we'll see where it finally settles. This week we're dropping the Tithing Blade, which is an artifact, so it works with the bounce synergies, but doesn't work as well as things that are enchantments. And then we're also dropping 1 Sheltered by Ghosts and bringing in the Bottomless Pool Locker Room, which allows you to continue to have the bounce, but and combat damage deals to a player draws a card, is sort of like the Enduring Curiosities that we saw in this build that are no longer here, right? So giving the deck a little bit of card draw off of some of your evasive flyers, I like it. Surprised there's only 1, really. Anyway, the lands, we also see a slight tweak, dropping 1 Underground River to bring in a Darker Waste, which is not, just reflecting kind of the change in blue versus black. And the best of 3 sideboard, we have 2 copies of the Get Out have been removed, which is the double blue that can counter an enchantment or creature, or it can bounce your stuff for 2 blue. And so I like that one. We got rid of that one. It felt kind of clunky, especially with a 3-color mana base. The double pit blue is really hard to do, right? Meticulous Excavation got removed, which again I think was kind of a bit of a stretch for like when you would actually want to take a turn off to be able to play that. And then we're also bringing out this Sporogenic Infection, which is similar to the Tithing Blade, and it's an enchantment that you can kind of move around, and then it's like an edict effect, but they have to blow up the thing that's not enchanted by the Sporogenic Infection. Again, it was a little bit gimmicky. So I like the fact that that's been kind of cleaned up, and the sideboard is starting to be a little bit more focused. We're bringing in an additional copy of Destroy Evil, which is the enchantment hate for against the mirror match, against domain, any of the enchantment heavy strategies, but you can also bring it in against some things that have power or toughness 4 or more, so like the Preacher of the Schism in some versions of Dimir Midrange, as we'll get into. Lauren of the Third Path also gives you the enchantment hate or artifact hate, again good for the mirror match, good against like Urabrask's Forge in mono red if they are running it, good against the Unholy Annex in the Demons package in black. And we've got a third copy of No More Lies. I think this one's largely being brought in to fight off like the 3 costed sweepers, like Temporary Lockdown. The strategy does not do particularly well to the cheap sweepers. So and then the Shelter by Ghosts got moved to the sideboard. Again, there's going to be some decks that have the interaction that can punish you for playing the Shelter by Ghosts and get a 2-for-1. Otherwise, there's other decks that are going to struggle against the lifelink that the Shelter by Ghosts offers, right? So again, I'll try to work on a sideboard for this one. It's going to take me a little while to get to, though, to be fair. And then the Tashana's Tidebinder is one that is good against the Planeswalkers, right? Anything that has a triggered or activated ability, you can then silence it with Tashana's Tidebinder, and you can silence man lands like the Restless Anchorage, and then it just stays, as long as the Tidebinder doesn't get killed, it can kind of neutralize certain threats. All right, and we also get a new archetype in Best of 3. So I'm loving life right now, right? Week 8, and we're still seeing new stuff. So week 8 here, number 1 on the Standard Challenge on Saturday, January 4th, was Azorius Omniscience by Canopus 16. And this one is a new archetype that is centered around looping through the Omniscience. You're going to loop the Invasion of Arcavios to go grab your Unnerving Grasp, which then allows you to bounce the Invasion of Arcavios to then Unnerving Grasp, and create a 2/2 each time that you do it. Now, this list is running the Season of Weaving, which also allows you to create a copy of that 2/2 and then bounce the Invasion of Arcavios back to your hand and loop it that way, so that you can create infinite amounts of 2/2s without actually going through your library, because Unnerving Grasp manifests, and so it uses up your library to create the 2/2s. So this loop kind of less prone to milling yourself out. And then we have a couple of text slots, so like the Grand Abolisher makes it so that your opponents can't cast spells or activate abilities, can just kind of destroy certain strategies. Temporary Lockdown for the early aggression, negate, and exercise that you can bring in for, like you can bring these in against the enchantment heavy lists. Kitsa, I'm not exactly sure when you're going to be bringing this one in. If you have a comment in the, if you guys know when you would really like to bring in Kitsa, let me know in the comments below. We can always have a community discussion about the sideboard as well. It doesn't have to just be me rambling. Rona as well. So there's a couple of draw a card and discard a card, which helps you get to enabling your combo. So maybe you bring in Rona and Kitsa when they're better at attacking your hand, perhaps. Something like that. But it's very similar to the Omniscience decks that we've been talking about in the Meta Breakers otherwise. So you're trying to mill with the Archaeologist, the Moment of Truth, the Picklock Prankster, Chart a Course, anything to get the Omniscience into your graveyard. And then, this one's not running the... Oh, sorry, this one's running Abuelo's Awakening. So I was like, the crime card. You can play the lists that are trying to animate the Omniscience from the graveyard in a couple of different ways, right? This one is doing the Abuelo's Awakening, which then can get the Omniscience for cheap into play. And then we have counter spells with the Confounding Riddle, so that your opponent isn't able to just completely wipe your board, because those 2/2s don't have haste, right? So you have to survive a round and untap. So you have to be able to counterspell the Sunfall or whatever to win with the strategy. But you can hit this combination of the Abuelo's Awakening on the Omniscience as soon as turn 4, and it's relatively consistent if you know how to, like, if you get lucky and if you mulligan correctly. So fun one to see. I think it's a little, I don't think it's here to stay, because it's a little bit of a I got you, because you didn't know what was going on. So now that we've actually seen it, it's going to perform a little bit worse. But you're definitely going to see people exploring it and talking about it in the best of 3 ladder on Arena. All right, now for the best deck in Standard, Dimir Midrange, at least the most popular deck. Although it's been consistently the most, I think, common in the top 8 as well, right? So Dimir Midrange by Miju Kumono. Sorry if I massacred your name. I try to do my best. So this was number 2 on Standard Challenge on Saturday, January 4th. And we're seeing... Okay, so last week I talked about the kind of the pacing between Dimir Midrange. Midrange in general can try to go fast and get under control, or it can go slow and try to go over aggro, right? So you see kind of a fine-tuning or a balancing act based off of how much aggro you anticipate to come up against, or how much control you anticipate to come up against, right? So this one is set up to be slower, so better against aggro, than last week's list, which was set up to get underneath control and to be faster than the mirror match in the other Dimir mid-range matchups. So this one is bringing in, taking out the Kaido Bane of Nightmares, and taking out one Tishana's Tidebinder, which Tishana's Tidebinder is not particularly good defensively. We're bringing in the Preacher of the Schisms, which is great defensively, but kind of slow. And then bringing in the 2 copies of the Shieldred the Apocalypse, which also is prone to trading down in value, but can really pop off by forcing everybody to draw cards, and but it stabilizes with Lifegain against mono red aggro specifically. So we're dropping the 3 Fabloom Tricks and the Shieldred's Edict, as well as the Spell Stutter, and we're bringing in the Phantom Interference. So Spell Stutter versus Phantom Interference, we kind of see that one just kind of a personal choice, in my opinion. We've got an additional Nowhere to Run, which points to there being more Boros Mice on the ladder. Same with the Pyroclasm coming in earlier in the Gruul Prowess list, is that there might have just been a surge of Boros decks in the Standard Challenge scene. So bringing in the extra Nowhere to Run, and we're dropping in an island to bring in an additional Soulstone Sanctuary. And the best of 3 sideboard, we've got Anoint with Afflictions dropped. We're dropping a Blot Out, which is particularly nice for the mirror match, especially the Shieldred-less mirror match. Excuse me. When the Shieldreds are less common, then the Blot Out is more likely to hit the Enduring Curiosity or the Kaido instead of the Shieldred the Apocalypse. We're dropping 2 copies of Negate, and that one's particularly nice against, things like Sunfall, which we've kind of seen Domain and mono white tokens taking. They're not as common as they once were, right? So the super strong control decks maybe don't need the 2 negates. And then we're dropping 1 Shieldred the Apocalypse because we brought it into the main. We're bringing in Defabricate, which is one that I haven't seen outside of this list. Being able to counter an artifact or an enchantment spell specifically kind of gives you a little bit of if they're running the Esper Bounce deck, the Defabricate I think works particularly well. And then it also can counter an activated or triggered ability, which matters for something like Kaido in a pinch sometimes, but usually you're just using it for the first mode, I assume. And then we're also bringing in an additional copy of Duress, which is the answer if you need something against sweepers. And we're bringing in the Kaido Bane of Nightmares into the sideboard. So the more that you want to be able to do aggro, you can with this list. You're just going to want to tweak out of the Preacher of the Schisms and bring in the Kaidos and bring in the Stab. And so you can kind of speed this deck up if you need to. And speaking of which, we're bringing in 1 Stab, which is an alternative to cut down. Works well against the Heartfire hero because then you don't take any damage. All right, and we've got mono white token control. So those negates go away, and then bam, mono white's back. Anyway, mono white basically is great, except for it can really struggle against domain, right? And so since we've seen kind of the Zur enchantment deck is not, it's not as common as it once was. I think that gives mono white a chance to shine, right? Mono white's particularly nice against the aggro decks like the Gruul Prowess decks and the Boros Prowess decks, and it's been my deck that I've recently been running a lot of it in best of three, just on the ladder, because I think it's a very fun ladder deck, because of everybody playing aggro on the ladder, right? So yeah, this one was by Levunga21. Took down first place on January 4th. The second set of the standard challenge, if you will. This one's not running Sarah Paragon, so if you look, I posted a sideboard guide earlier today in the community tab for mono white control, and the version I was running, I did have Sarah Paragon, and Sarah Paragon's particularly nice against Dimir Midrange, and anything that kind of you want to be able to extend a little bit from their mono black removal, right? And so this one's bringing in the 3 additional copies of the Overlord of the Mistmoors, and bringing in a split up as well, giving you kind of a cheaper sweeper as opposed to just relying on the Sunfall on 5. And we're dropping the Soul Partitions. We're also dropping the 2 Virtue of Loyalties, or the Ardenvale Fealties, and we're bringing in 1 Ossification, and dropping the planes for a 4th copy of the Demolition Field. So honestly, largely still the same core, synergizing off of the card draw from the Caretaker's Talent as well as the Enduring Innocence. This deck can really chew through a lot of its library. And the best of 3 sideboard, we also see a slight change. So we're dropping 1 Boonbringer Valkyrie, going down to just a single copy. We're dropping 2 Not on My Watch, which was the exile targeted attacking creature for 1 and a white. Works well against aggro strategies. And we're bringing down 1 Split Up as well, which is kind of brought into the main. And then we're bringing in a 4th copy of the Authority of the Consuls. And this is your bread and butter against anything that has haste, right? Any of the mono red, Boros Prowess, Gruul Prowess decks, the Authority of the Consuls is a fantastic card to be able to sideboard into. And it completely negates Urbrask's Forge, because Urbrask's Forge then just spawns a tapped token that gains you a life. So one of the cards that I think is why we're seeing Urbrask's Forge kind of disappearing from a lot of sideboards. I still think it's mono red's best Hail Mary against this deck, because mono red really struggles against this strategy. But we also see Regal Caracal coming in, which is you get a 3/3 and 2 1/1s that have lifelink, and then those 2 1/1s become 2/2s. So you get 7 worth of stats across 3 bodies, some with lifelink for 5 mana. So it's particularly good against certain matchups. And I'm still trying to figure out where my favorite time to bring in the Regal Caracal is, and it kind of feels honestly like an alternative Boonbringer Valkyrie, but it helps you with maybe against the Boros Prowess or the Jeskai Convoke, any of the go wide strategies you can kind of keep up with, but I still haven't 100% figured out when I like to bring in the Regal Caracal. And then this one's not running the Angel that I had, that's also being explored, that kind of does a similar thing, except for with Angels. But it is bringing in the 2 copies of the Rest in Peace. So with the sideboard I posted today, you could just, drop the Regal Caracal and then drop the Angel that gives all the other Angels +1/+1, and run the 2 copies of the Rest in Peace. And I think that's probably where I would be for the latter, right? Because Rest in Peace is nice against Azorius Oculus. It's good against any of the enduring strategies, and Team Marauders, etc., right? And then Dimir Midrange by Die Max, and took down 2nd place. So we've got 2 versions of Dimir Midrange, and on January 4th. And this one's got a lot more 1-ofs, and so it's not as a focused strategy, but it's got a little bit of things that we've seen throughout the weeks, right? So we've got 3 copies of Kaido instead of 4, so we are dropping that down as well. Enduring Curiosity being dropped here, and we're bringing in 3 copies of the Deep Cavern Bat. Again, kind of depends on how many cut downs and how many one-costed cheap interaction there is to answer the Deep Cavern Bat. In the last couple of weeks, we've seen it coming back into things like Golgari Midrange. Some versions of Dimir Midrange have decided to run it. So it's kind of up to you whether or not you feel like your tournament meta is going to have enough answers for the Deep Cavern Bat. But we're bringing in Gix. And Gix was really replaced out of a lot of the Dimir strategies, I think, largely to go into more of a mono blue space. So this one is going more mono black than it is mono blue, or at least more heavily towards the mono black. So then you can kind of justify the Gix. And the upside to the Gix is that you get the Enduring Curiosity effect, although you do have to pay the 1 life, a turn sooner than you do with the Enduring Curiosity, right? And then we've got a Mockingbird, which can, acts as a 4th copy of the Enduring Curiosity. It just curves out with whatever you really need it to be. And then you can also copy their stuff, right? Shielder the Apocalypse here, bringing in 1 copy there to help out against the aggro matchups and punish the mirror match for drawing a bunch of cards or making your fairy masterminds into a win condition, all of that fun stuff. Dropping the 3 copies of the Fabloom Trick and bringing 1 Go for the Throat, as well as the 2 Spell Stutters, and bringing in the Anoint with Affliction. Again, this is good against like Mosswood Dread Knight, Unstoppable Slasher, and bringing in the 2 Phantom Interference. So both Dimir Midrange are favoring the counterspell that stops at a quench. It never gets more than the counter your controller pays 2, but it does have the upside of being able to create a body, whereas the Spell Stutter does not, right? And the Soulstone Sanctuary we've got dropped as well, down 1 to bring in a Fountain Port. So Fountain Port, Mirrex, Soulstone Sanctuary, take your pick, right? And the best of 3 sideboard, we've got Blot Out is also dropped, Ghost Vacuum was also dropped, Gix's Command was dropped 1, so we still have 1 against the go wide strategies, and like Boros Prowess, Gruul Prowess. Dropping 1 negate instead of having the 2, we've still got 1 in there against like Domain. We're dropping the 2 Shieldred the Apocalypse, 1 of which was moved to the main, and then the Tishana's Tidebinder, and we're dropping 2 of those, and 1 of which was moved to the main. Again, not great on defense, but good against certain matchups with triggered and activated abilities. And then bringing in an additional copy of Duress against Control, as well as 1 copy of Urtai Resurrected, which synergizes nicely with the Fairy Mastermind, commonly seen in this archetype throughout the weeks, because of being able to offset the penalty of making them draw a card with making you draw a card, or punishing them with the Shield of the Apocalypse. And we've got 2 Fabloom Tricks in the sideboard. This one is, I think I like it more as a sideboard card because it is a little bit of play versus draw. It's not as good on defense as it is on offense, so it's better on the play, in my opinion. But the Fabloom Trick, there's, especially like in the mirror when you're trying to outrace other Dimir mid-range decks, being able to tap their flyer and then be able to get in for the double card draw the following turn if you have the Enduring Curiosity as your turn 4 after a turn 3 Fabloom Trick, it's a nice line. And then we've also got Malicious Eclipse, which is the sweeper for Prowess decks and mono white control, since we're seeing that one again. Jeskai Convoke, any of the go wide strategies. And then 3 Preacher of Schisms against the aggro matchups where you want to stabilize against the early pressure. All right, number 15, or number 1 on Sunday, which is the biggest tournament of the week. Sunday, January 5th was Azorius Oculus by Karate Dom, and we're dropping 2 Kioras. The Rising Tide, which is the threshold, creates the 8/8 Kraken, plus, draw 2, discard 2, helps fill the graveyard for your Abhorrent Oculus and such. And we're bringing in the 2 copies of Split Up in the main, and being able to give you the sweeper. This Split Up works particularly well with the flying strategies of the Abhorrent Oculus and the Haughty Djinn, as I mentioned last week. You can, because they both have flying, you can kind of more easily control whether or not you're playing this after attacking and destroying all of their stuff that's been sitting back, or vice versa, leaving all of your stuff back while they attack into you, and then you just destroy all of their tapped creatures. So it gives you like a one-sided board wipe. This one's dropping the Lauren's Escape, which is kind of like the 1 white protection spell. We're dropping Soul Partition, down 1 copy, and dropping 1 Unsummon, which both help out against the early aggression. And instead we're bringing back in the 2 copies of the Moment of Truth, which helps you enable your combo. So I like having the Moment of Truths, I think, up if you can afford it, right? If you're getting steamrolled, then you need the Soul Partition and the Unsummon to survive. But if you've got enough pressure relief, if there's not enough aggro, you can justify having the Moment of Truths, and I think that makes the deck work better. We're running 1 negate instead of the Lorens. It's just kind of a way to protect a single target, but it also has an answer like if they're running a Sunfall, it doesn't, Lorens Escape doesn't protect you from that. And it's the same cost if you have a Haughty Djinn in play, right? It's 1 blue if you have the Haughty Djinn, whereas Lorens Escape is just 1 white. So I like the negate over the Lorens Escape personally. And then we've dropped the 2 A Darker Wastes to bring in a Plains and an Undercity Sewers. So the best of 3 sideboard, we see a different approach than we did a couple of weeks ago. So we're dropping the Elspeth Smite, which is a good option against the aggro decks like Mono Red, Gruul Prowess, Boros Prowess. And we're dropping the 3 copies of the Monastery Mentor. And this one's just accepting the fact that if you're good at stopping the strategy by attacking the graveyard, then so be it. Right? We're not going to mess around with the Monastery Mentor and try to do these alternative strategies that don't work as well. And we're bringing in 2 negates in the side. Somewhat matchup dependent. The more control, the more likely you're going to bring in the negates. Worse off against the just purely aggro creature strategies, right? Split up in the sideboard. You could bring in this one again if you've got another. We've moved 2 of the split ups to the main, but we've dropped 1 split up from the sideboard. So it used to be, yeah, you got it. You can pump this up to 3 if you feel like it's advantage to do so. And then 3 copies of Authority of the Consuls, and we've already talked about this one. Really good against anything that has haste. And then we're bringing in Beza, the Bounding Spring. There's some matchups where Beza is particularly nice at giving the life stabilization, generally aggro strategies instead of control. And then we've got the 3 copies of Fairy Mastermind, and that one's the answer, this pilot's answer, instead of the Monastery Mentor. So if they're attacking our graveyard, we're going to play the Fairy Masterminds, and it's really, that I'm sure that catches people off guard. And the other thing too is that like with the Fairy Masterminds and the Undercity Sewer, you can trick people into thinking that you're Dimir, or the Esper Bounce deck, and then be like, surprise, no, I'm not. I'm playing the Azorius Oculus deck, right? So I think the pilot was up to some cheeky stuff in this build, and we've got 2 Lauren of the Third Paths for some artifact hate. All right, and the last one we're going to talk about, second place on the Standard Challenge on Sunday, January 5th, was Dimir Bounce by Rasta F. And this one is also a new archetype. It's very similar to the Esper Bounce archetype, but is not running the Nurturing Pixie, but still has a lot of the same core, right? So we've got the Fear of the Isolation and This Town Ain't Big Enough to bounce our black enchantments of Hopeless Nightmare and Nowhere to Run. We're bringing in a little bit more interaction, though, with the cut downs and the Go for the Throats, since we don't have the white, and bumping Kaido up to 3. And then we've got the Storm Chaser's Talent, which can synergize with This Town Ain't Big Enough to constantly loop over and over, and the Flood Pit's Drowner to kind of stop their strategy as well. And Spyglass Siren gives you an early target for Kaido to ninjutsu in. So I actually think that Dimir Bounce might be a more consistent space, instead of losing some games to not having the right mana to play 3 colors. And the upside to this too is that you can play stuff like Soulstone Sanctuary a little bit more readily in a 2-color space instead of a 3-color space. So we'll see if Dimir Bounce actually wins out over the Esper Bounce builds, but only time will tell. And the best of 3 sideboard, we've got Cut Down against aggro, we've got Negate against control, Duress against control, Gix's Command for sweepers for go wide strategies, Tashana's Tidebinder for planeswalkers like Kaido. Get Out is still seeing play in this one, which was a sideboard last week in Esper Bounce. I think it's more justifiable in Dimir Bounce than it is actually in the 3-color space. And then we have 3 copies of Preacher of the Schism, which also helps this deck out against the aggro, since we don't have the Sheltered by Ghosts that white was bringing in that gives us the lifelink. And then 1 Shieldred the Apocalypse, also similar to Dimir Midrange, the Shieldred and the Preacher of the Schism to kind of come in against mono red aggro, Boros Prowess, Gruul Prowess. So thank you for listening to my ramblings. I enjoy doing it every week, and I've heard from you guys that you enjoy it too, so that's always nice. And thank you for being a part of my community, and for those who have been able to help me monetarily with, help me out with some becoming a YouTube member and such. I greatly appreciate it. I've been talking at 90 miles an hour now, trying to get this all done in under an hour, and we got there. And if you have any questions, if I skip something in the best of 3 sideboard, feel free to let me know in the comments below. I respond to every comment, right? So like if you've got something, let me be a useful tool for you instead of an adversary to beat. So yeah, with that, tomorrow I'll be talking about the community deck tech. So I still haven't picked out any of the decks yet. I'll be picking them out Tuesday morning, and then going over the review throughout the day. So look for that tomorrow. I can only pick about 4, and we're going to be doing it randomly. So if you want your deck to have priority in being picked, that's one of the benefits to being a YouTube member. And it's just some silly thing I can do to kind of say thank you for helping me out. And yeah, with that, I have talked myself to death, and probably you as well. So enjoy playing Magic the Gathering in whatever form you find the most enjoyable. And remember, all of these strategies can take you to Mythic. It's more important to find something that you enjoy playing than it is to play a specific archetype because you think it's the best, right? It's really not, 56% win rate versus 58% win rate means it's going to win 2 more games if you play each deck 100 times, right? They're largely comparable is what I'm trying to get at. And so yeah, enjoy Magic. I do, and it's great. Take care, everybody.